A diplomatic reset as U.S. President Donald Trump hosts Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan at the White House. Why Pakistan and why now? What are both sides hoping to accomplish? And can the United States pull out of a costly war in Afghanistan without Pakistan's help? More on Plugged In, U.S., Pakistan, and the Taliban peace talks. Hello, welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. New territory for Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan as he visits Washington for his first official visit to the United States. He was welcomed at the White House by U.S. President Donald Trump. It was the first ever meeting between the Pakistan Prime Minister and President Trump. Their goal is for increased cooperation for both nations in the hope of stabilizing a region that's been ravaged by war. Khan wants financial assistance. Trump wants American troops out of Afghanistan. Plugged In Steve Reddish has our report.
Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan is seeking to restore U.S. aid to his country. U.S. President Donald Trump ended that aid last year, saying that Islamabad was not doing enough to fight extremism.
The problem was Pakistan, this is before you, Pakistan was not doing anything for us. They were really, I think, subversive. They were going against us. I tell you what, to be honest, I think we have a better relationship with Pakistan right now than we did when we were paying that money.
Trump blamed the Obama administration for a lack of Pakistan's cooperation.
I think Pakistan can do a tremendous amount with respect to Afghanistan. They didn't do it, and I don't blame them because they were dealing with the wrong president. Who knows? But I think Pakistan could have done. They're helping us a lot now. I think they could have helped us a lot in the past.
Trump said the U.S. aid, amounting to $1.3 billion, could be restored to Pakistan depending on what's worked out, he said. He wants Pakistan's cooperation on reaching a deal with the Taliban to end the war in Afghanistan and withdraw U.S. troops from there after almost 19 years.
I think Pakistan's going to help us out to extricate ourselves. We're like policemen. We're not fighting a war. If we wanted to fight a war in Afghanistan and win it, I could win that war in a week. I just don't want to kill 10 million people.
Khan said there is no military solution in Afghanistan.
I feel, and I think we will discuss this, it's the closest we have been to a peace deal. And we hope that in the coming days, we will be able to urge the Taliban to speak to the Afghan government and come to a settlement, a political solution.
So far, Taliban leaders have refused to negotiate directly with the government in Kabul, calling it illegitimate and a puppet of the United States. The group has met with U.S. representatives for 7 rounds of peace talks. Negotiators claimed progress in the latest round of talks that began June 29th in Doha. But at the same time, a Taliban attack in Afghanistan killed 25 people. Steve Reddish, VOA News, Washington.
Given the long list of items for discussion, how much room is there for meaningful negotiations between the two nations? And what does the United States really want from its meeting with the Pakistan leader? For more of the meeting between the two leaders, we are joined by VOA White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman. Steve, what is it that the United States is looking for in an agreement with the Taliban?
Well, the main thing they want is for American soldiers in Afghanistan not to be targets anymore of the Taliban, for terrorist attacks to stop against the infrastructure of Afghanistan, and find a way that the United States can pull out most, if not all, of the remaining forces in the country and not have the Taliban overrun the government in Kabul.
One of the things that we understand that they want is to make sure that the Taliban assured that Afghanistan did not continue to be sort of a fertile ground for launching attacks against other parts of the world, against the United States, against Americans. Is there any movement on that?
Well, there are a lot of very encouraging words from Imran Khan, who many in this town see as a refreshing face coming from Islamabad as the relatively new prime minister of that country. But there's also a lot of skepticism that we've heard very encouraging words and promises from the Pakistanis for many, many years, and when push comes to shove, nothing really changes.
Well, Imran Khan has only been prime minister for about a year. The Taliban and the agreement we're talking about is in Afghanistan. Taliban is also in Pakistan, where Imran Khan is the prime minister. What, if anything, can Imran Khan do?
Yes, we have to remember, is a civilian leader of the government. The military apparatus, which operates with some degree of autonomy in Pakistan, is very powerful, as is the intelligence agency, the ISI. And then you have the border regions in Pakistan, which are basically lawless. And Imran Khan, talking about that here in Washington, has said he's tried to repeatedly warn people that for the Pakistani army to go in there and try to assert control would only be a disaster.
Well, we're in a minute going to go to Pakistan and find out the reaction to this statement by the president. But the president did say something in the Oval Office that has been making headlines, is that he could win the war in a week, but he'd want to kill 10 million people. What's the reaction at the White House to that statement?
Well, it's another one of the statements that the president made that people here wish he did not make. It certainly doesn't improve the image of the United States with some of the elements in Afghanistan. Hamid Karzai, the former president of Afghanistan, has been speaking to VOA's Afghan service about it and basically saying it was a terrible comment, and the U.S. should have never been in his country in the first place and should get out as quickly as possible.
Over the last approximately 19 years of this war, Steve, there's been talk about, when you're talking about the Taliban, the treatment they have of women and whether or not that would ever be part of any negotiations. And the women in the Taliban are treated very harshly by the Taliban. Is there any discussion? Does the topic of women seem to bubble up to the top discussion these days with this negotiation?
I don't think it's bubbling up to the top. It is definitely a concern, and I've spent some time in Afghanistan, traveled around the country, and the consensus is that any territory that is going to be under the control of the Taliban is going to have that ultra-conservative attitude towards women in that country.
Well, the conversation that the president had openly in front of the press with Imran Khan was vastly different than his tweet of about 18 months ago, in which he said they've given us nothing but lies and deceit. And he sort of echoed that again in the speaking with Imran Khan in the Oval Office. But he said that's changed.
Yes,
how's that changed?
Well, I think because Imran Khan used the force of his personality, stressed that he was someone who also used his celebrity and wasn't part of the conventional political system in Pakistan. That helped convince Trump to meet with him, and there seemed to be pretty decent chemistry between these two leaders when they met. Of course, Trump likes to think that he can solve these problems in one-on-one meetings with other leaders, and there are others around him who are trying to caution the president that we really need to see some concrete moves by Imran Khan in Pakistan before rewarding the Pakistanis. But of course, the president gave an instant reward to Imran Khan in the Oval Office with his statement that Prime Minister Modi in India had asked him to mediate on the Kashmiri territorial issue between Pakistan and India. Pakistan's been in favor of a third-party involvement in that from the United States, where India's been vehemently opposed to that. So that was a major victory handed to Imran Khan right there in the Oval Office.
Steve, thank you. Steve Herman, our VOA White House Bureau Chief. The relationship between Pakistan and the United States is long and rocky, friendly as well as frosty, depending on the situation. Complicating things even more is the U.S.'s nearly 20-year war on terror. For more on this complex relationship, we are joined via Skype by Aisha Tanzim, VOA's bureau chief in Islamabad. Welcome back to the show, Aisha, and tell me, what is it that Prime Minister Imran Khan was looking for by coming to the United States to the Oval Office to meet with President Trump?
Well, first of all, he was looking to reset the relationship with the United States, which has been really rocky since 2011, but particularly rocky since President Trump announced his South Asia policy almost 2 years ago. So for the last almost 5 years, there's been no meeting between the principals or the top leadership of the two countries. So that was number one. But also, Pakistan's doing really badly economically. So it's just negotiated a $6 billion 3-year loan with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. But that loan is not going to come all in one go. That loan's going to come in tranches. And with every tranche, IMF is going to ask for Pakistan to fulfill what many are calling very, very, very strict requirements. So that loan was only possible because Pakistan helped the U.S. with the Taliban, because previously top-level U.S. officials said that United States taxpayer money could not be used to, Pakistan has a lot of debt from China, and they said U.S. taxpayer money could not be used to repay Chinese debt. That was an indication that Pakistan would have a problem getting IMF loan, where U.S. is one of the biggest stakeholders. The second thing is, in October, there's going to be a meeting of an international money laundering and counterterrorism a terrorism funding watchdog, the Financial Action Task Force. Pakistan is right now in the gray list of FATF, which creates financial difficulty in international transactions. Pakistan really wants to get out of that gray list, and U.S. can really help Pakistan in that. So those are the two big gets that Pakistan needed. Go ahead, Greta.
One of the conversations, one of the headlines, I don't want to overemphasize this, but I asked Steve Herman about it, is the president's rather muscular language, which we're quite accustomed to here in the United States. He said that in 1 week he could take care of Afghanistan, but 10 million people would be killed. And we in the United States have, heard his muscular language like that before. But I'm curious, how is that being received, or is the Afghan government responding to that, and is the Pakistan government responding to that?
The Pakistani government hasn't responded. The Pakistani government's trying to put a really positive spin on this interaction and doesn't want to say anything negative. But the Afghan government has responded strongly. They've put out a press statement. They've said that Afghanistan's an ancient country and is dignified on the world stage. And they've asked a clarification through diplomatic channels of what the president actually means. Not only that, the Afghan Taliban that the U.S. is negotiating with right now to end the war in Afghanistan, they've also put out a statement in Pashto, and they've said that the U.S. needs to remember the history. Afghanistan's the graveyard of the empire and shouldn't be impractical in analyzing the situation there. So very strong reaction from Afghanistan. Pakistan is trying to put a very positive spin on this whole interaction and this meeting. So I don't expect anything coming out from Pakistan on that issue.
Aisha, we've talked so much about the Taliban in Afghanistan, but there's Taliban in Pakistan. Is there a way to describe how widespread that is, and whether Prime Minister Khan can do anything about that in his negotiations?
And that's exactly, Greta, you've hit the nail on the head. Pakistan says we have some influence with Taliban, but our influence is, depreciating, and it's not as much as people expect, and we can do some things, but we can't do everything. The U.S. obviously expects Pakistan to be able to do a lot more and expects that Pakistan has a lot more influence. We can see it in the language that the U.S. has used in background briefings and even in the readout after the meeting. We can see it in the priorities set, the agenda priorities, which said that it had, the U.S. had two agenda items that were at the top. Number one, to convince the Taliban to have a ceasefire and to talk to Afghan government, and number two, to deal with the other terrorist groups that the U.S. says are operating in Pakistan, not just Afghan-centric terrorist groups, but India-centric terrorist groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. And the fact that in the White House, there was a bigger luncheon with delegations from both sides, but there was a smaller meeting with a very few people from both sides, and that included Pakistan's Prime Minister, Army Chief, and DGISI, the head of intelligence. That showed the U.S. priority, that it really had security on its mind, while Pakistan wanted a broader talk on trade and on increasing investment. U.S. really wanted to hone in, focus on security, focus on Afghanistan, and the fact that they had the smaller huddle with just the president, prime minister, and the intelligence and military showed that the U.S. understands that without the military's help, they cannot move forward on these security and terrorism and Taliban-related issues.
Aisha, thank you. Aisha Tanzim, VOA's bureau chief in Islamabad. And in Doha, the capital of Qatar, negotiations between Afghan and Taliban officials on a so-called roadmap for peace appear to be making progress. But is it enough to end 18 years of war? More on that from Plugged In's Millar Sega.
At a two-day meeting of more than 50 Afghan politicians, Taliban officials, and civil activists, One participant told VOA that traditionally ultra-conservative Taliban attitudes may be changing.
I feel their attitude has changed, and they are ready to talk to women. Last night at dinner was the first time I met with Taliban representatives, and some of the envoys came to talk to us.
But senior Taliban representative Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif tells VOA that Taliban leadership will not accept decisions imposed on the group regardless of political or military pressure.
The war community, including the government, including their alliance, they used all their best in the pressure in Afghanistan, but they are defeated. Now it is the time to respect each other and to respect the reality and to respect the right of each other, and then they will. We are sure we should find a way.
The Taliban has in the past resisted negotiating with the Afghan government, calling it a puppet of the United States. They insist that any government delegates attending intra-Afghan talks are only there in a private capacity. But Washington has made it clear that the Taliban must deal with the government in Kabul before a final peace deal can be approved.
We have made progress, but no final agreement yet.
Helping to facilitate a peace deal are the governments of Qatar and Germany.
The efforts made by many over the past few years and months, especially the ongoing talks between the United States and the Taliban, have opened up a historic opportunity. But as important as those talks are, they cannot be enough. Dialogue has to turn into a meaningful negotiating process.
But even as rival groups discuss ways to end the 18-year war, there's a renewed sense of urgency for lasting peace following a Taliban attack July 7th in the Afghan city of Ghazni, which killed 14 people and wounded more than 180, a third of them children. Millar Sega, VOA News, Washington.
Joining us to shed more light on the delicate peace negotiations between the Taliban and Afghanistan is Michael Kugelman. He is the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. Mr. Kugelman is a foreign policy expert on Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Is there, looking at sort of big picture, is there a way to compare and contrast the Trump administration approach to Afghanistan and the Taliban and the previous administration, President Obama?
Well, for Trump, the big thing is peace talks and negotiations. Trump wants to end this war. Obama wanted to end the war as well, but Trump wants to end it even more. So that's why he's really doubled down on this objective of getting a real peace process going. And he's had Zalmay Khalilzad as essentially his man to try to do everything possible to get the deal that will allow Trump to pull troops out of Afghanistan. And I would argue that getting a deal in Afghanistan is probably Trump's core goal in South Asia right now.
Well, it seems to me that one of the difficulties, if I were sitting in the Oval Office or even our Prime Minister of Pakistan, that we have is that in trying to negotiate a settlement between the Taliban, you have to have a centralized government. I mean, there's no centralized government of the Taliban, so who do you talk to? That's number one. That's the number one problem. The other number two problem is that the agreement needs to be made with the Afghan government, and the Taliban as a whole sees the Afghan government as simply a puppet of the United States. So how do you go about trying to resolve this?
Well, it's a big mess, because you're right, there's a lot of factionalization within the Taliban, and it's really the moderate elements of the Taliban, those that are based in Doha, that are involved in the negotiations. Now, theoretically, the top leadership of the Taliban has signed off on this, and they sent some of their top people to be involved in negotiations. But to be sure, if you were to get a peace deal, and that's a big if, there's no reason to believe that the entire Taliban organization would abide by a peace agreement. You could still have factions that would continue to fight, even if there's a peace deal.
How big is the Taliban? We say the Taliban all the time. I mean, how big is it in Afghanistan? How much is it bleeding into Pakistan? If an agreement is resolved in Afghanistan, how much then goes back over the border into Pakistan?
Yeah, well, I mean, essentially the top leadership of the Taliban is based in Pakistan, but the organization is quite large, and I think the U.S. government tends to understate the numbers. I mean, you hear 20,000, 30,000, but I think it's actually more like 40, 50,000 Taliban fighters, which, of course, may not sound like a huge number, but that's not small.
Is it significant that Prime Minister Khan came to the United States? Is that a significant step forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the main reason he was invited to the White House was Trump's way of recognizing what he believes to be Pakistan's assistance to this point in trying to get a peace process started with the Taliban. And the U.S. government does believe that Pakistan to this point has been helpful, particularly by actually physically getting Taliban representatives to the table to start these talks.
Let me go sort of off on a tangent. Dr. Al-Afridi, who is believed by Americans to have helped identify and locate Osama bin Laden so that the United States could go in and get him. He was picked up subsequently after helping the United States. He's been held in prison in Pakistan. Many Americans believe that he should be released and maybe even permitted to come to the United States. Is Dr. Al-Afridi part of the discussion now?
I mean, I'm sure that Trump brought Afridi up in his discussions with Imran Khan. I don't think it was a big part of the conversation. But Trump has mentioned Afridi before, and what's important is that those close to Trump, those that have his ear, such as, for example, Senator Lindsey Graham, bring up the Afridi issue a lot. I don't think Pakistan is in any hurry to release him. They view him as a spy, to be sure. But for Trump, he would derive major political benefits of getting Afridi released, because he could essentially say to his political base, well, look, I freed the guy that helped us track down Osama bin Laden, but I just don't think Pakistan is ready to release this person.
When I was in Pakistan a number of years ago, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and she was announcing $7.5 billion in the Kerry Lugar bill of economic aid to Pakistan. And when she arrived in Pakistan, it was thought that it would be received well. But I remember people saying to me is that the Pakistanis were upset because the United States was going to give this aid, but then wanted to know where it was, what it was being used for, and they saw that as strings attached, and they were sort of, at least the ones I spoke to, resentful towards Americans and their largesse of giving them money. Mm-hmm. What's the Pakistani sort of man on the street view of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, Pakistan, there's a lot of anti-American sentiment in Pakistan, and I would argue that it's against U.S. policy, not Americans per se, but yeah, even the fact that the U.S. tripled its civilian assistance to Pakistan in the Obama period, that didn't go over well among many Pakistanis. They thought it was essentially a big bribe to buy off Pakistan, to get Pakistan to do the things that the U.S. wanted it to do, such as go after terrorists more robustly, help the United States in Afghanistan, and so on. There actually were no strings attached to that civilian assistance. It's actually somewhat of a misconception that Pakistan sort of put out that narrative. There were no strings attached to that. The security assistance had strings attached, but the civilian aid was conditions-free.
In looking at what the United States, and looking at the negotiations with the Taliban, one of the things that I don't hear about, I hear about the ceasefire. They work with the Taliban talk to the Afghan government. One of the things that I don't hear about now is the atrocious treatment of women by the Taliban. Is that just not part of the discussion now? Because it used to be part of the discussion.
It's a terrible shame, because we all know the Taliban's record when it comes to women. The Taliban claims that it's different now, that it sort of projects itself as the Taliban 2.0, treats women better and all that, but the areas of Afghanistan now, and there are quite a few that are under Taliban control, from what we hear of those that managed to get in to see how things are going, treatment of women doesn't sound to be any better than it was in the 1990s when the Taliban ran the country.
Michael, thank you very much. Michael Kugelman, who's the Asia Program Deputy Director at the Wilson Center. And it's been almost 20 years since the U.S. began the war on terror, and the Taliban in Afghanistan have been a major focus of that war effort. The war in Afghanistan is now the longest-running U.S. military endeavor, sometimes called the Forever War. It's lasted more than 18 years. It began 1 month after the Al-Qaeda attacks on 9/11. On October 7, 2001, a U.S.-led coalition of 136 countries began bombing the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which had supported the terror group. 3 U.S. presidents, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, have overseen the war. U.S. troop levels in Afghanistan have fluctuated over the years, from 30,000 before 2009 to over 100,000 in 2011. The human cost of war has been high. Tens of thousands of Afghan civilians have died, and more than 2,400 U.S. troops have been killed in combat. According to the Pentagon, it has also had a large price tag. In 2018, the war cost roughly $45 billion, but that's down from an average of about $100 billion from 2010 to 2012. Since 2018, The United States has been engaged in direct talks with the Taliban, seeking to negotiate a settlement that will both end the war and guarantee that Afghanistan once again does not become a staging ground for future terror attacks. Over the weekend, the Taliban claimed responsibility for 2 deadly attacks that killed at least 9 and injured at least 30 others. The attacks occurred at a security checkpoint and a hospital in northwestern Pakistan. These attacks underscore concerns about just how the Taliban will be contained if and when the United States pulls out of Afghanistan. Joining me to discuss the ongoing threat of terrorism in the region is the managing editor for VOA's Extremism Watch Desk, Hasib Ali Kozai. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Greta.
Assume that an agreement is worked out with the Taliban, and assume that the United States gets out of the region. Troops come home. What happens next? Is there a vacuum there? Will there be other terrorist groups?
Right now in the region, Afghanistan and Pakistan, there are active 20 terror groups, including the Afghan Taliban, including the Pakistani Taliban, the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and a bunch of others. So recently, the nominee for the joint chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff also pointed this out, that there will always be a residual U.S. presence, military presence for counterterrorism missions. So to fully pull the U.S. troops out, there will certainly be a vacuum. And there's always the issue of whether we can trust the Afghan Taliban or not, and whether they will provide a fertile ground for terror groups in the region. So the U.S. would most likely keep some sort of presence in the country, even if a deal is reached between the Afghan government, the U.S., and the Taliban.
When you say there are 20 groups, a group could be 3 people, it could be a lot more people. I mean, is there a more of a numerical description? I mean, how big are these groups? I assume they're varied, but...
These groups are U.S. designated terror groups, and you're talking about thousands of fighters, tens of thousands of fighters. If we're talking about, for instance, Lashkar-e-Taiba, it has its own forces, Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Islamic State, Khorasan branch that covers Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Central Asia region. You have Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So you're talking about tens of thousands of fighters there.
All right, the United States has never taken any land in war, and the United States wants to get out of the area, and the United States wants people to stop killing each other. They want to stop the terrorism. What is it that these 20 groups want?
They are basically, some of them are insurgent groups, but most of them are terror groups. And
But what do they want?
They just want to drag U.S. and the Western powers into long wars and basically drain them of their resources. That's basically they're taking the insurgency concept and applying it at the world stage. What they want to do is they initially want to start in rural areas, which is the third world part of the country or the global south, and they are carrying out terror attacks there and also against Western targets in an effort and hoping that the U.S. or the West will go after them. And once they do that, then it will be a typical counterinsurgency where the rebel groups, the militant groups, the terror groups will not use as much resources as the West would use. And that's basically their end goal.
All right, with less than a minute left, is Pakistan getting ahead of the game on fighting terrorism within its border, its Taliban inside its borders, as well as the other terrorist groups?
There's always this skepticism that Pakistan has been selective in cracking down on militants, going after militant groups that pose a security threat to the country and overlooking militant groups that pose a threat to the security of Afghanistan, the U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and India. But it has yet to be seen whether Pakistan will actually deliver on its promises. One thing that's important to be pointed about Pakistan is counting, has a very good knowledge of how the U.S. government works, and basically Taliban and Pakistan are both might be counting on the fact that the U.S. would never deploy back to a region it has deployed troops in a similar fashion at least, and they are basically waiting out the U.S. to see if the U.S. will pull out, and then Pakistan would seek a client state.
Hasib Ali Kozai, thank you very much, from VOA's Extremism Watch Desk. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America, and you can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta, and do follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.